Clean Energy Solutions Center in the Global Buildings Performance Network. We're very fortunate to have Neve McDonald, Jim Edelson, Ian Finlayson, and Christiane Egger joining us today. This outstanding group of panelists will discuss getting building codes right, the lessons learned on the road to a performance-based approach. And one important note of mention before we begin our presentations is that the Clean Energy Solutions Center does not endorse or recommend specific products or services. Information provided in this webinar is featured in the Solutions Center's resource library as one of many best practices resources reviewed and selected by technical experts. Now, before we begin our presentations, just want to go over some of the webinar features. For audio, you have two options. You may either listen through your computer or over your telephone. If you choose to listen through your computer, please select the mic and speakers option in the audio pane. Doing this will eliminate the possibility of feedback and echo. And if you select the telephone option, a box on the right side will display the telephone number and audio pin you should use to dial in. And panelists, we just ask that while you are not presenting, please mute your audio device. And if anyone has any technical difficulties, you may call the number that's on the bottom of the slide right now, and that is 888-259-3826. And we encourage all attendees to submit any questions that they might have throughout the webinar. If you do have a question, you may submit that through the questions pane in the GoToWebinar window. And if you are having difficulty viewing the materials through the webinar portal, you will find PDF copies of the presentations at cleanenergysolutions.org/training. And you may follow along as our speakers present. Also, an audio recording of the presentations will be posted to the Solutions Center training page within a few weeks. I'm getting some background noise from one of the presenters. Could everyone just make sure that you mute your microphones right now, please? Now, we have a great agenda prepared for you today that is focused on the importance of adopting a performance-based approach to energy code design to achieve ambitious energy targets. Now, before our speakers begin their presentations, I will provide a short informative overview of the Clean Energy Solutions Center initiative. And then following the presentations, we'll have a question and answer session where I can present the attendee questions to the panelists, and then closing remarks and a brief survey. Now, this slide provides a bit of background in terms of how the Solutions Center came to be. The Solutions Center is an initiative of the Clean Energy Ministerial and is supported through a partnership with UN Energy. It was launched in April of 2011 and is primarily led by Australia, the United States, and other CEM partners. Outcomes of this unique partnership include support of developing countries through enhancement of resources on policies relating to energy access, no-cost expert policy assistance, and peer-to-peer learning and training tools such as the webinar you're attending today. There are four primary goals for the Solutions Center. First goal is to serve as a clearinghouse of clean energy policy resources. And the second goal is to share best practices, data, and analysis tools specific to clean energy policies and programs. Third, the Solutions Center delivers dynamic services that enables expert policy assistance, learning, and peer-to-peer sharing of experience. And then lastly, the center fosters dialogue on emerging policy issues and innovation around the globe. Now, our primary audience is energy policymakers and analysts from governments and technical organizations in all countries. But then we also strive to engage with the private sector, NGOs, and civil society. And one of the marquee features that the Solutions Center provides is its no-cost expert policy assistance. This is known as Ask an Expert, and the Solutions Center has established a broad team of over 30 experts from around the globe who are available to provide remote policy advice and analysis to all countries. So, for example, in the area of energy efficiency in buildings, we are very pleased to have Cesar Trevino, leader of the Mexico Green Building Council, serving as our expert. So if you have a need for policy assistance on energy efficiency in buildings or any other clean energy sector, we encourage you to use this useful service. Again, it's provided free of charge. So if you want to request assistance, you may simply submit your request by registering through our Ask an Expert feature at cleanenergysolutions.org/expert. And we also invite you to spread the word about this service to those in your networks and organizations. So in summary, we encourage you to explore and take advantage of the Solution Center resources and services, including the expert policy assistance, subscribe to our newsletter, and then participate in webinars like these. And now I'd like to provide brief introductions for our distinguished panelists today. Our first speaker will be Neve McDonald, Buildings Policy Analyst at the Global Building Performance Network. And following Neve, we will hear from Jim Edelson, Senior Manager of Codes and Policy at the New Buildings Institute. And then our third speaker today will be Ian Finlayson, the Deputy Director of Energy Efficiency Division at the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources. And then our final speaker of the day is Christian Egger, Deputy Manager of OO Energies Harverband, Austria. Hope I pronounced that correctly. And with those introductions, please join me in welcoming Neve to the webinar.
Thank you, Sean. So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Neve MacDonald, and I'd like to start by welcoming you to today's webinar on performance-based building codes. So the webinar will focus on the experiences of countries who have implemented performance-based measures and the key lessons that they have learned from doing so. Today's webinar is actually the second in the series, Getting Building Codes Right. And the aim of this series is to delve deeper into some of the best practice building codes that are out there, and to hear how they have gone about developing these codes. As part of the series, we were asking questions like, what were the key drivers for change in these countries? What were the main opportunities and the barriers that were faced? And what are the key lessons that countries have learned while implementing these performance-based measures? So the real aim of the series is to facilitate the sharing of best practices about how to implement state-of-the-art building energy codes. The webinar series is based on the GBPN Policy Comparative Tool, so let me just bring this back to the start. So I'm just showing you a little demonstration from our website. So you can see here it's based on 25 best practice building codes, all representing best practice in their region. There are 15 criteria that we've specially developed, and the building codes are scored against these criteria. So you can analyze and compare the codes using an individual criterion or by selecting multiple criteria, and you can see that on the screen right now. So you can demonstrate, you can look at them by score, so all of the codes are scored against these criteria. Or you can look at them alphabetically. If you hover over the icons, you can see the scores that have been awarded to each of the codes against those criteria. So the key lessons that we've learned from this tool is that there's no such thing as one perfect or overall best code, and that some codes have scored better in some areas while others have scored better in others, and we can all share best practices. So based on our analysis using this tool, we found that there are 3 areas in particular that require a little bit more focus, and these are the focus of this webinar series. So our first webinar focused on the importance of long-term targets and frequent revision cycles, and that's available to download on the Clean Energy Solutions Centre website. Then we have today's webinar, and the third webinar will focus on enforcement, looking at best practice experiences from different countries, particularly Sweden and the US, and that will happen on the 10th of February, and more details will be available on our website, so keep an eye out for that. So back to today's webinar. Although basic steps towards zero energy can be taken by improving individual elements of the building, we really need a holistic or performance-based approach to code design and construction if we're going to make any meaningful energy savings. So as part of today's webinar, we're going to hear from Jim, Ian and Christiana, who have all been involved in advocating for and or developing performance requirements in their region. So Jim is going to start by giving us an overview of the current situation in the US, and he's going to talk about the drivers for change that they're seeing in the US. And he'll touch on outcome-based building codes also. Ian is going to provide us with more detailed information and some real experiences from Massachusetts. Then we're going to hear from Christiana, and she's going to provide us with some more insights from Upper Austria, and going to talk about their progressive code in Austria. So without further ado, I am going to hand you over to Jim. Thank you.
Thank you, Neem. It's an honor to be available to provide this slides for the audience today. As Neem said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the U.S. situation and the reason that we are interested in performance-based codes. Sometimes we call performance-based codes outcome-based codes, and sometimes we refer to them as codes based on modeling, but that's a different level of performance. I work for the New Buildings Institute. We're located in the Northwest United States. We are a nonprofit organization. We work specifically on commercial building energy efficiency, and we are involved in levels of programs and research, starting with building science and all the way through the design guidance up to policy, which we're mostly talking about today, and we provide code assistance to states and at the national level in the United States. What I'm going to try and talk about today, explain, is the drivers to performance codes in the United States, and go through three different sort of concepts related to performance. First, we'll talk about design, which is really what the model codes are oriented around, what level are buildings designed to perform at, and that is today being driven in many of the states and cities by reductions to the 2030 goals and zero net energy. Beyond that, I'm going to then talk about the operation of the buildings, and this is actually achieving those design levels and a lot of the shortcomings that we experience today in all facets of codes. And then in the final thing I'll touch on will be deployment, and this relates to the wide discrepancies and variations among states and cities within the United States, and then even within those states and cities, the levels of compliance that are achieved in each. So to start with the design level of codes, this is a frequently seen graph. It plots the 90.1, ASHRAE 90.1 is one of the primary model energy codes in the United States. And as you can see, if we were approximately at 100 EUI, it's the energy use intensity in terms of kBTU per square foot, we've gone from about 100, and the 2012 code is somewhere below 60, and we expect that the 2013 code will be close to 50. And this is the same with the 2012 IECC, which is the other major model energy code in the United States. Beyond that, you can see the plot of the red line, and those are the actual Architecture 2030 goals. That's a nonprofit organization that set a zero net energy goal for 2030 for buildings and houses in the United States. So that's the outline of where we want codes to go and where we would like energy use in buildings to go. In actuality, even though we've set these goals and put these levels into the prescriptive portions of codes, what we do know from surveys and research are that there is a much wider range of outcomes in actual buildings once they are operated and occupied. And so that is one of the real drivers behind performance codes in the United States, is that though we may intend our buildings to operate at going to zero at 2030, we do see that will be harder than just making a code that says buildings will be getting to zero. This is some research that the New Buildings Institute did a few years back. This is our referred to as the LEED study, and in here a lot of people emphasize the range of variability just among high-performance buildings, which LEED buildings are. But what I want to emphasize is more specifically what happens as EUIs tend towards zero or closer to zero. And as you can see, this table, which represents the ratio of the actual energy use in buildings to what it was modeled to perform at, increases. And this is a clear trend that as a building is designed to use less energy, the variability increases, especially at the lowest end. And that has to do with many factors. Many of them could be operations or complex systems, but one of the main obstacles to achieving very low energy uses is what we call sometimes miscellaneous equipment or plug loads. And as you see in this next table, this is an actual example of what we call a zero net energy retrofit that was in Portland, Oregon, and this one was actually sub-metered. And you can see the pie chart on the left. There are 4 large blocks of energy use: cooling, heating, lights, and equipment. But as the building was retrofitted, and again, this is actual meter data, the miscellaneous equipment clearly dominates as buildings get closer to zero. And in fact, it exceeds all the other energy uses for this building as it was retrofit to zero. Another way to look at this is on the, this is information from the Energy Information Administration. This is the largest U.S. building database. What we have here, it shows that in another sense, the lighting, the HVAC, and the water heating all were major portions of the energy use in 2005, but the projections are that all the growth, and we believe this is actually 2008 data, we believe it's underestimated, but all the growth and almost the entire energy consumption net growth between now and 2030 is going to be in this miscellaneous equipment, especially as the systems and the building designs get closer to zero. This is a schematic that MBI put together, and as you can see, if we look now around 2010 or 2015, the design components are decreasing in importance. But what is slower to decrease is the operating characteristics of the building, whether it's used correctly, the controls are commissioned correctly, the schedules are set, and the nighttime hours are observed. And then on top of that, what are the tenants doing? Are they bringing in the space heaters? And as you see on this table, it really will be the design components have already started to decrease from 2000 through 2015, and now what our mission is, and one of the reasons we're changing the performance code, is to get at this operating characteristics and tenant behavior within the commercial buildings. So that brings me to the operation phase of energy codes, and this prevents 2 big challenges, which are targets and enforcement. And I think Ian will go through a similar graph to this, but it's easy to pick a number and to choose a target, and like I said, on the design phase. But what's really happening, again, is that there's a wide range of variation in buildings into how they're actually performing. So that means, how do we set these targets so individual buildings can actually meet them? One of the hopes that we do have in the United States is the rapid spread of disclosure ordinances or disclosure laws, and you'll see across the United States, though there is a wide variation, both residential and commercial buildings are seeing an increasing frequency of mandatory reporting of energy use. But that still brings us, even if we are able to set the targets and we do have the data, that still brings us to what I call the big red line for energy codes, and that's certificate of occupancy. And our energy codes in the United States are construction codes, which means when the certificate of occupancy is issued and the building starts being used, there really is no enforcement capability among a normal code official and their statutory authority. So what we're seeing develop in various jurisdictions, and this is some of the lessons we're starting to learn about performance code, is how can we start getting at the energy use after condition or after the occupancy certificate has been issued. One use is what we call a temporary certificate of occupancy, and that will be proposed in the International Green Construction Code, one of our green codes, and that will be hopefully adopted within the next year as a green code. Seattle is using something like a performance or a surety bond that ranges up to $4 per square foot. You heard Dwayne Johnson talk about that in the last webinar in this series. I will go a little bit more into what Boulder, Colorado is doing, and we are also seeing some ordinances in cities like New York City that calls for periodic retro commissioning for larger buildings. So we are starting, but this is more of an operations code. This is not a construction code. So this is one of the large challenges for getting to performance or outcome regulation in the United States. So Boulder, Colorado has really identified, this is a lot of words, but if you look at the boldface in this paragraph, there you can see they are driven by their climate action plan. They realized in 2010 they were not on their path to meet it, and so they needed additional policy tools. So what they came up with something called SMART regs, and this is an ordinance that actually requires multifamily buildings to achieve energy levels and demonstrate energy performance. And they, in addition to the environmental benefits, they also cite building quality, safer, healthier, and more comfortable housing, and lower energy bills. And actually, this has actually been a very, exceeded their expectations and success. They've actually have 500 units achieving compliance in the first year. Many of the property owners did not know that their buildings were not performing until this regulation took effect, and so they are actually exceeding the requirements at this point, and it's gaining broad support, and we hopefully, we're doing some work in Boulder and hopefully supporting them in making this type of program more widespread. So we are just beginning to touch on these types of regulations, and as you see, it's mostly cities experimenting. As I said at the beginning, one of our major problems, and you may hear more about this in the next webinar, is that the United States is not a single energy code, but the energy code is enforcement and adoption is devolved down to state and city level. And you can see a whole patchwork here. The orange or red states, whichever how it looks on your screen, are the ones that have actually adopted the most recent model codes, whereas the white or the light codes have no statewide building codes at all. So for instance, Colorado, which actually adopts codes city by city, and we just saw Boulder with one of the most advanced codes, is right next to Wyoming, which has no building energy code at all. So this is a very big challenge for achieving codes and performance codes. I'll touch slow, and so this is the question of deployment within the United States, and there is a federal law that set states to have goals of 90% compliance rates. But as you see, we don't have the money or the resources behind it to achieve that. One of the solutions that is now on the table is coming out of the IECC, which is one of the model energy codes, and that was a proposal called RE188, which sets an energy resource index, energy rating index for each of the climate zones in the United States. And this is a performance approach that takes into account all the energy use within the house. And this is a platform that we believe can be, as you can see, just moving those goals closer to zero will be a path towards net zero for those communities that use this approach. And then this also increases compliance because it can use third-party inspectors to actually achieve energy compliance and energy code compliance, and that is one of the big shortcomings, enforcement of our energy codes. So I think, hopefully I only had 10 minutes to go through this, but hopefully I've touched on the major concepts that we in the United States are looking to work through to get to the performance codes and the net zero goals, and that includes, the design of the building, the model codes that go to zero, getting past that certificate of operation, and achieving performance so we can actually achieve the net zero goals within individual buildings, and then deploy those types of codes across the states and cities. And I just wanted to close this to let folks know that this is not particularly a federal issue. That's in one way fortunate. The fortunate thing is that if the Congress was involved, it would probably be a setback, and that would be a more difficult path for us to achieve performance goals and net zero. But it also eventually could be an opportunity, because as the country realizes it's not meeting its energy use targets, Congress can be a positive force. So with that, I'd like to turn it over and hand the mic over to the esteemed Ian Finlayson from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and he'll talk more about the successes in one of our most progressive states in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, and it's a pleasure to be on this webinar, and to be working alongside Jim and Christiane again, because they're both people who've been quite influential in terms of what's been happening in Massachusetts over the last few years. So to build on what Jim was saying, I'm going to walk you through a little bit of what's been happening in Massachusetts over about a 6-year time period now. And we by no means have all the answers, but we've started on a pathway towards performance-based codes, and then related to that, operational ratings. And I think it's something that we will look to continue to do for a few years ahead. So as Jim was describing it as sort of design, operate, deploy, I'm going to talk mostly about the design in terms of why we chose performance-based code, and then also a little bit get into the operate in terms of why we're looking at energy ratings for existing buildings, and less so on the deployment, because we're still a work in progress there, and I think Christiane has more experience in that arena. So first, a little background on Massachusetts. We're a fairly small state within the United States. We like to have undue influence, but the reality is that we're not a big player when it comes to energy. And what this diagram shows you is that we have no in-state energy resources other than renewables and energy efficiency. And we did an assessment of that in 2007 and 2009, and realized that it was really a penalty for our economy at the state level to be importing a lot of fossil fuels from other parts of the country, not all of them friendly to Massachusetts and the United States. So that really led to some landmark energy legislation at our state level. And the two pieces that I want to draw your attention to today are our Global Warming Solutions Act and our Green Communities Act. And what the Global Warming Solutions Act did was it set greenhouse gas targets both for 2020 and then for 2050, and required us to produce a plan and show our ongoing tracking and reporting towards those goals. Where the Green Communities Act was much more energy focused, and it expanded our investments in energy efficiency, both in new building construction and in renovating existing buildings. And it required that we move to adopting the national model energy codes that Jim was telling you a little bit about, and do those updates regularly. And so on the national picture that Jim showed, we were one of the bright lights of states that are maintaining that energy code adoption. Another thing that it did, and this turned out to be quite influential, was it established a local government program. Towns and cities can elect to become green communities, And that, as you'll see, has been a significant driver of change in our state. So just to give you context for our Clean Energy and Climate Plan, we had been trending along at more or less level emissions since 1990, before we had a major policy intervention. When we made our plan for 2020, the biggest portion of that, the largest wedge, if you can describe it that way, is from the building sector. And then the second largest wedge is from the electricity supply, which is primarily supplying the building sector. So it became very clear that buildings had to be a major source of energy savings and emission savings. And then within those two wedges, there's this explicit goal for advanced building energy codes, which is 1.6% of the total by 2020, primarily from new construction. So that's all good and well, but that doesn't require us to do performance-based codes. So why did we make the decision to move in a performance-based direction? Well, there are a lot of factors, but to get to the primary driver of that, we had our incoming governor in 2007 went to our major energy conference and regional energy conference and really called on both public and private sector actors to come together and deliver a report to the state recommending how we could get to zero net energy and setting some target goals for zero net energy for residential buildings around 2020 and commercial buildings by 2030. And I'm not going to read the whole report to you, although it's available for download. But the number one recommendation from the commercial task force is up here, and that was to establish energy performance standards. And the number one recommendation from the residential portion of the task force was also to establish energy performance standards. So it was fairly clear from that body and over the intensive year of convening of that group that if we were going to get to zero net energy, we would need to take a performance-based approach and do that in a fairly comprehensive manner. So that really started us down the path. And the first thing that we took a look at was our energy code for the state. And again, Jim has sort of laid out that the model codes in the US are the ASHRAE standard 90.1 and the IECC, which stands for the International Energy Conservation Code. It's not really international, but it is an energy code. And those codes, as we adopted them in 2009, were primarily prescriptive in approach. They do have performance options, but they were somewhat underutilized, and they didn't offer many design trade-offs. So as a first step, we said, well, we can add a more directly performance-based option on the residential side. And so we used the system that's most prevalent in the US, the HERS rating, which is governed by a nonprofit group called ResNet. And then for folks in Europe, you may be more familiar with the Passive House methodology. And so we added a Passive House option, not expecting a large uptake of passive houses, but to signal our intent to reward people taking more of a whole building performance-based approach. Now, beyond that, we realized that if we were going to move codes in a significant way, we needed to have an alternative to the base code. And a number of towns and cities in the state were already asking to go beyond the ASHRAE and IECC base codes, so similar to Boulder in Colorado. So we really tried to partner with those interests, and we developed something called the Stretch Energy Code. And essentially that takes a performance-based approach or migrates the code towards a performance-based approach. On the residential side, we used the HERS index from ResNet, which is calibrated off a standard new home in 2005 at being 100 on the scale and a zero net energy home at 0. And for the first round of the stretch code, we set a target of 65 or 70 depending on the size of the unit. So smaller multifamily units didn't have to meet as aggressive a target as larger single-family homes. Now, the advantages of this in terms of moving down the performance pathway, to echo Jim again, it brought in a third-party energy specialist who works with the builder from the design phase all the way through to that certificate of occupancy. It also brings in diagnostic testing, so really testing the air leakage both of the whole home and of any ducts in the home that are common in the U.S. for heating and air conditioning systems. And finally, it allows more design trade-offs, so you can get more energy efficiency, hopefully at less cost to the builder because they have more design flexibility. So that was the residential code, and we more or less developed that in-state with a lot of input from folks that were doing these programs through national level efforts like the EPA Energy Star program. On the commercial side, you'll see down on the bottom of the slide, we work with the New Buildings Institute, and I got to meet Jim Edelson back in 2008 around this project, where again we wanted to move towards performance, but we wanted to use existing tools and protocols that were previously developed. So we used the ASHRAE 90.1 standard, but required performance modeling, and they had developed that method, and it had already been picked up and used by the U.S. Green Building Council for LEED ratings. So we leveraged that existing standard, and then we worked with the New Buildings Institute to develop our prescriptive option in a way that added some flexibility and some design trade-offs to encourage builders to save more energy, but to do so at relatively low cost. And so that got us really started down the road of performance-based codes. And at the time, we had heard from a handful of communities that had expressed strong interest in this, and we've been pleasantly surprised by how well received this has been. We're currently at over 50% of our state. The towns in orange on my screen, or the darker color, have chosen voluntarily to choose this stretch energy code, and primarily that's driven by votes at the town council or city council level. So it's very much a local issue, and we're seeing that customers are voting with their feet and saying, we'd like to know more about the energy performance of our buildings, and we'd like to be more efficient and more climate friendly. So our crude explanation of the value proposition here is that if you provide these energy ratings through code in this case, then you increase awareness. That adds market value to the buildings that are being built, and that leads to greater investments in energy efficiency, which is our end goal. So we talked about that from a design standpoint so far, but we realized that, to Jim's point, a lot of the action is in how buildings are operated and how people use their buildings. And so when we're talking about existing buildings, the building code in the United States really stops once a building is occupied. And so we're now working on how we would rate those buildings in use. And so I want to talk briefly about what we're doing right now on the residential side. And so the slide here shows a scorecard that we've now developed. There's 3 variations on this, but this is the most widely used one right now. And this is a scorecard for existing homes where a homeowner chooses to get a free energy assessment. They can get a scorecard like this at the same time, which shows their energy performance in actual annual units per year, but also then their greenhouse gas footprint and some expected energy saving numbers if they are to take advantage of the recommended energy improvements. So we're really trying to move to encourage homeowners to understand their energy usage and to take advantage of opportunities to improve their energy efficiency. And beyond that, we also have a pilot for commercial office buildings where we're looking to have, as buildings move out of construction into operations or as older buildings turn over, the opportunity to inform those users and those owners. And in other sectors, anywhere we have leverage, we're interested in introducing performance concepts to building owners and operators. So we have something called the MEPA greenhouse gas modeling requirement. Large commercial developments in the state, which could be hospitals or supermarkets or casinos or laboratories, they typically all have to come through our office and show with energy modeling that they are reducing their greenhouse gas footprint over what the model energy code would require. For schools, there's a national high-performance schools standard, but in Massachusetts we have a slightly more stringent version of that, and we provide incentives for people to build greener and do that with energy modeling. And then with our public buildings at the state level, we also have a beyond model code and beyond LEED standard. So that's roughly what's happening in Massachusetts right now. In terms of some of the lessons learned that we think might be relevant to other places, I'd definitely say that we've taken the approach of trying to integrate performance everywhere where possible, but with some prescriptive backstops so that energy performance is not giving away or reducing standards, but improving them. We definitely took the path of least resistance in building on existing above-code programs that have been funded through the work of the federal government and the electric and gas utilities in our state, and then initiatives like the Green Building Council's LEED rating program. We found that legislation was a real game changer in terms of reorienting people and their expectations for what ought to happen in the building sector. We found that training is an invaluable piece of the puzzle. It's not enough to just set design standards or labeling standards. You really have to do outreach to as many stakeholders as possible to explain why you're doing this and how it works and how they can take advantage of it. And we've been pleasantly surprised by how much interest there has been in this from customers, homeowners, building operators, building users, and we really think that they want information and they want fairly complex information to help them understand their buildings. And finally, we found that government at the local level has been a real driver for change, and that there's a lot of grassroots movements that really want to see energy savings and climate savings, and that if you can tap into that, it's a very helpful dynamic in moving the ball. So that's my summary. I'm happy to hand over now to Christiane Egger, who can tell you what happens with a longer period of time to implement these things.
Thank you, Ian. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. My name is Christiane Egger. I work for the state of the region of Upper Austria, and I'll try to share our experience with performance-based codes that we have gathered over the last between 10 and 20 years. Just to give you a bit of background, the state of Upper Austria is one of the 9 Austrian states located between Vienna and Salzburg, those familiar with Austria. And what is important, building legislation in Austria is done on state level, on regional level, so those familiar with the European situations, the implementation of the European Building Performance Directive is done to 95% on the state level. My own organization is the Energy Agency of this state. We promote energy efficiency and renewables, and we provide services to all building consumers and to all companies, to households and public bodies. And we support the development of legislation and policies. An important building-related program is the Energy Advice or Energy Consulting Auditing program. We provide 10,000 face-to-face energy advice sessions to homeowners, businesses and public bodies, and in most cases this has to do with building-related investment, new homes, new schools, renovation of a business building or something else. We have been involved in building rating, building certification, as we say in Europe, since the early 90s, and my organization has rated more than 100,000 buildings since 93. We also manage a network of companies that are active in energy efficiency and renewables. There is a website in English in case you're interested. Together these companies, 170 in our state, have a turnover of $3 billion US, and they employ nearly 9,000 people, and they do that in the fields of solar thermal, biomass heating and energy efficiency in buildings. So actually three things that have to do mostly with the building sector. Renewables and energy efficiency have a long tradition in our state. Today, renewable energy provides about a third of our total primary energy. 15% of that is clean biomass, so mostly biomass for heating. 11% is hydro and the other renewables. In the heating sector, we have already achieved a share of about 50% of renewable heating of building, and echoing the slide of Massachusetts, by having the renewables we have today, we avoid import of fossil fuels in the order of magnitude of $1 to $2 billion US every year. As this has been going pretty well in the 90s and in the first half of the previous decade, in 2007 the state government decided that by 2030 all electricity and space heating will come from renewable energy sources, and clearly in this transition the building sector has a key role to play, and especially performance-based building codes are a key element. So easy to say, 100% electricity and space heating from renewables. How are we going to do this? I always use this picture of the carrots, the sticks and the tambourines. Carrots for financial incentives, sticks for the legislation, for the regulatory, so what we are talking mostly about today, and the tambourine is the information, the awareness raising, and the training. So if we look at the sticks, a key element here is building rating and building labeling and disclosing. Then we have performance standards for heating and cooling. I'll show you a slide in a moment. Then once a building is in operation, there is the obligation for regular inspection of boilers and air conditioning systems, and we have an obligation to use renewable energy for heating in all new public buildings and in all new buildings larger than 1,000 square meter. Now, if you, I would mention the performance standards and how they developed over the years. So on that slide, you can see it's the example of the performance requirement for single-family homes over the last 20 years. And you can see from the year 94, when we started out with a requirement in the order of 110 kilowatt hours per square meter a year. Today we are at 54, and with the requirements laid down in the European building directive that requires us to already have a plan until 2020. So by 2020 this will go down to 34. So this gives a very clear message to the building sector of what is going on, and it allows technologies to be developed. And in overall, I think this is a very, very important and maybe the only way to progressively increase building requirements. knowing the energy performance of buildings is also helpful when you have financial incentives. So in our case, a main instrument in the housing sector is we provide low interest loans for efficient construction and renovation, which is also based on energy performance indicators. And then we also provide investment grants for renewable heating and specific energy efficiency measures. For commercial buildings also there are grants available based on energy performance indicators from the federal level, and there are a range of other instruments in this field. And last but not least, the tambourine, the energy advice, the training Ian just mentioned is also a very, very important element of this building policy. Now taking back a step, what is for us an energy performance indicator? It's a slide we use when we give presentations to the wider general public. So miles per gallon for the US audience, and for the building in a simplified manner, this would be heating or electricity or CO2 or a combination of all these per square meter and year. Now, if we look at the factors that influence the energy performance indicator in our climate and in our way of calculating it, we have the orientation of the building and the solar gains, the insulation quality, the ventilation losses, the heating system, and the use of renewables, and the geometry of the building. Why are energy performance indicators so important in our point of view? They allow for a comparison between similar building uses. They empower the building owners. And the calculation of energy performance indicators is quite complex and has become even more complex when you include CO2. So it's really something that only a few people, experts, will understand. But if you have a rating A to D, that's something everyone is able to understand. It helps us to motivate to use renewables. It gives an impulse for building improvements and renovation. It allows us, as I tried to show you just a moment ago, to drive legislation, and it helps us to better target our scarce public funding into the right channels. Over history, we started in the 70s in Austria and in the different Austrian states to have U-value-based building codes. Then in 93, we for the first time introduced the energy performance indicator as a funding requirement. In 99, that was the big step. We had for the first time building codes that were based on energy performance indicators for heat. And also still using minimum U values, which we still do, just to make sure, like a fallback proposition, that in case something, that not too extreme solutions are being chosen. In 2002, the European Building Performance Directive came into force, the first one that required energy performance indicators. In 2007, we required them for the first time also for non-domestic buildings, and since December last year, also in implementing the European legislation, the energy performance indicator must also state in all advertising, and this is really, for those of us who have been doing this for a couple of years, this is really makes a very, very big change. So if you open up the advertising section of any newspaper here, and where real estate is advertised, they all include now the energy performance rating. A key element of the rating is the performance certificate. We started in 93 as a part of a funding program, and since 99 it's a requirement in the building law. We require it for any new construction and renovation, for housing and non-residential, and for any sales and renting. So even if you don't touch the building at all, but it's being sold or rented out, then an energy performance certificate has to be issued and included in the contract. And public buildings and large buildings must display the energy performance certificate. We also we also try always at the same time to improve the building shell and to work on the heating systems. So you can see here the developments for the heating systems of single family homes. So in 1999, about a third had oil heating and a third installed renewable energy technologies. And today, oil heating has disappeared from new homes and more than 85% use renewable energy sources. And speaking of renewable energy sources, the most important in our case here is automatic biomass heating. These are fully automatic systems, either wood pellets or wood chips. In case of wood pellets, they are delivered by a bulk truck, and it's become a standard solution for homes and also in an increasing number for domestic buildings. In summary, some of the lessons learned. When developing codes and adapting them, we have to always find the right level, and this is a very difficult task, between a high level of energy efficiency ambition and a high level of market activation. For example, for renovation, if we set the requirements too high in the efficiency sector, then this might deter people from renovating. So we really have to find a very good balance here. Then, as I tried to show you, we try to continuously tighten the requirements. In the incentive programs, we aim to avoid boom or bust programs, like you sometimes see them, where they have programs for one specific technology, then all the market rushes there, then you have a shortage on that. So we try to keep this in a good balance. Information, training, that's what Ian already mentioned, and quality assurance are key. There is no one-fits-it-all solution for mobilized different market segments, so this is also something we have learned. Financial incentives work for some segments. Legislation, which is in theory work for everyone, is also better adopted by some market segments than in others, where you find a less higher level of compliance, and come back to what I said earlier, the right combination of sticks, carrots, and tamarins. And if you're interested in learning more of what we do, and would like also to come to a meeting where you not only hear the people but also see them, I would like to invite you to our conference on nearly zero energy buildings, which will be held at the end of February. It's a very large international conference, and it would be great to see many of you there. And with that, I thank you for your attention and hand back to the organizers. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you, Niamh, Jim, and Ian, and Christiane for the great presentations. We do have some questions coming in from the audience, and I'd just like to remind the audience that if they have any questions, they can submit those through the question pane, and we'll take this time now to present those to the panelists. The first question I received is for Jim. Jim, can you provide a little more detail on the conditional occupancy proposed in the IGCC?
Yeah, thanks for the question. There is a large group of national organizations working together to draft a proposal that will be submitted to the International Green Construction Code as of January 9th, and it's being coordinated by NIBS, the National Institute of Building Sciences. And we believe this is similar to a proposal that was in the IGCC in the last cycle, but it will set targets for energy consumption, and there will be a temporary, in the proposal there's a temporary certificate of occupancy issued for up to 36 months, and within that 36 months the building will have to provide 12 months of data to show that it meets its energy use target. So that is a proposal, and we look for we welcome input if anyone wants to contact me directly.
Great, thank you, Jim. And the next question is aimed towards Austria. Is passive house playing any role in Austria?
Thank you for that question. Passive House had a very important role in pioneering technical solutions. So, for example, triple glazed windows were first developed and used in passive buildings. Today, triple glazed windows are a standard solution that practically in all new homes would use triple glazed buildings. However, Passive House is a private initiative by a private group of people. This is different from the building codes and from what government said. But it was always a source of inspiration to a certain segment of the market. However, we have learned that this segment that actually is willing and interested to do Passive House remains more or less since the last 10 years on the same level, which is about 3 to 5% of all new builds.
Thank you, Christiane. And the next question is also for you. And it asks, what about the financing incentives? You talked about how there's a really important role in developing new technologies like biomass and gasification. How about financing incentives to achieve those goals?
We have in Austria since World War II a small levy that everyone pays on their income tax. It's called housing levy, and this levy is used for supporting the investments in new housing and in renovating housing. And what we did, so this is an existing instrument that has been around since more than 50 years. So what we have done beginning in the early 90s was to introduce energy criteria into these and energy performance requirements into these housing programs, and we have tightened these over the years. And we find that actually in our specific situation this is an even has a stronger impact on the market than the regulatory field, because all homeowners are aware of these programs and what they are required to do in order to get this funding. In addition to supporting energy efficient construction, we also provide direct grants for heating systems, so biomass heating, solar thermal, and heat pumps, where you get about 20% investment grants depending on the specific situation if you install one of these.
Great. Thanks again, Christiane. And the next question is for Ian. And the question is, a common argument against introducing performance-based building codes is that they will negatively affect small builders. Have you experienced this in Massachusetts? And if so, how did you address the issue?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So, I mean, Massachusetts is a state that is, it's not a major growth market, unlike some of the southern and western states in the U.S. And so we have a lot of small builders, and they're still a big piece of the construction market and certainly most of the remodeling market. And we really haven't experienced any problem there. I mean, that's not to say that all builders in the state love having to pay more attention to energy codes, but we've seen plenty of small builders be successful and embrace this approach. Generally, they have taken advantage of the training, and they care about word of mouth and reputation, so they oftentimes also participate in town and city level discussions around codes. And many of them have become quite strong supporters of this approach because it allows them to showcase how new buildings can be much better energy performance than existing homes. And a lot of times that's their competition in the market.
Great, thank you, Ian. And the next question that we have is just directed towards everyone, I believe, and that is, what was the most difficult task in going to performance-based codes? And the second part of that question, what implications did this have for enforcement of codes?
I guess I can start there with the experience in Massachusetts. I think as soon as you propose doing something that's different from what's been done in the past, and then additionally is different from what the national model codes are proposing, then there's quite a high bar of scrutiny. You know, why would we do something different than what the national model codes are already doing? And why would we have more than one option for codes in the state? Those were the primary concerns, and that was where a lot of the discussion was early on. But I think once you take that step and people start to work with performance-based codes, they very quickly see the benefits. And a lot of that, I think, is on the information and awareness side. So being able to compare a home with other homes is, it seems simple, but it's a real game changer for a lot of people. And for builders, once they realize they can build much better than the competition, be it existing homes or other new construction, it's really valuable to them to have that information and make it available to the public. So it's that first step, I think, is the hardest, and then we've seen that it gets easier after that.
Okay, maybe I can add. As Ian said, it's really when you start, I think in our case the biggest was the educational challenge. We have many small builders who have very little time available to attend training courses. What made it easier in our case, we started not with the building requirements, we started with a voluntary funding program. So this allowed the market actors to learn over a period of time, a couple of years, and then when it became the code, they were already familiar with these energy performance indicators. So that was very helpful. However, this is a longer period that will take at least a couple of years, I guess, in most places in the world.
Yeah, this is Jim, and the only thing I would add is that, you know, Ian mentioned the model codes, the national model codes, and, you know, we are having some resistance to introducing these concepts into the national model codes. But we see a growing interest from code officials in these codes, in these performance codes, because in the end, they're really a measurable quantity and easier to enforce in the end. So it's a matter of time, I think, as people become more comfortable with the concepts.
All right, thank you again to all three of you. And the next question, again, is for Christiane, and it concerns energy performance requirements in Upper Austria. And the question is, are the presented requirements only for heating and cooling, or additionally include the other energy consumption associated with the buildings, such as ventilation or domestic hot water?
Thank you. This is not such an easy question to answer, because in fact we decided among the 9 Austrian states when implementing the European Buildings Directive that there are actually 4 different performance indicators, and so some of them are heating only. Then we also have one that includes the CO2, so that's all energy use. And it also depends whether it's for the funding programs or for the building codes. In general, for housing, the requirement is at the moment for heating only. For non-domestic buildings, this also includes heating, cooling, ventilation, lightings, and other building-related energy uses.
Thank you. And the next question is again for Ian, and it is, what do you see as the role of stretch codes playing in facilitating funding from utilities for code compliance efforts?
Sure. In our state and in a lot of the states, certainly in the northeast of the country and the west coast, we have significant funds from gas and electric utilities that are directed towards improving energy efficiency in new construction and in home renovations. And they're tasked with incentivizing performance above code. So having a base code and a stretch code allows us to say, well, base code communities are not going to get those incentives unless builders are voluntarily going beyond the base code. But stretch code communities, you've got a situation where all the builders are going beyond that base code. And so there's more of a comprehensive incentive program available to them because the utilities and the builders know if they're building in communities that are stretch code users that they will be above code, and it's just a question of how far above code those builders are willing to go. So we have some builders now building subdivisions that are better than net zero. They're energy positive homes, and they're maxing out on utility incentives, but we have the majority of builders building just beyond the stretch code level and taking lower incentives from the gas and electric utilities. But that's a relatively streamlined process, and we're actually working to make that more streamlined going forwards. And I mean, the tambourine, as Christiane calls it, the education and outreach component, that's an area where we're really looking to collaborate much more with the gas and electric utility programs too, so that we're doing joint trainings or co-sponsoring trainings so that the information comes along so that builders are made aware of the incentive opportunities and the performance requirements at the same time.
All right, thank you. And another question from the audience. Has there been any talk of exporting the Austrian building apprenticeship training programs to the U.S.?
Thank you for that question. Well, at the moment we are just trying to sell equipment, but no, that's a joke. Yeah, well, we have what we call the dual educational systems, meaning that there are apprenticeship programs where people spend their learning to be a builder or learning to be a heat installer or an electrician, and they spend part of the time in a business that is committed to a teaching role, where they also do some practical work, and they spend a part of the time in a school. I'm not aware of any actual real program of exporting this, but if anyone is interested in some further information, I would be very pleased to provide that.
Great, thank you, Christiane. And another question from the audience. Given the pending disruptions coming to the SOP of utility business models, is there any chance utilities would borrow to retrofit rather than build new generations?
So I can speak about that again in the Massachusetts context. With our Green Communities Act of 2008, we essentially require gas and electric utilities to prioritize investments in energy efficiency above investments in new generation capacity or purchasing. I mean, the generation capacity isn't owned by the gas and electric utilities in our state, but before they sign contracts to acquire additional resources, they have to first show that they're maximizing investments in energy efficiency. And so we've more than doubled our investment in energy efficiency since passing that legislation, and we now make investments in the order of $600 million a year statewide in energy efficiency. And that covers both new construction and existing building retrofits. So I think legislation is probably needed, and there has to be a reconciliation factor so that shareholders of these gas and electric companies don't take huge losses, but if that can be figured out.
Thank you, Ian. And I have one more question for you. And this question is for Christiane, and it is, how did you make the case for funding the 10,000 customer education outreach meetings?
Thank you for the question. Well, I think this is easier in a small state where politicians that fund our programs are closer to end consumers, businesses, etc. But we have been able to show that actually the energy advice and the outreach program is a very, very cost-effective solution, especially when it is combined with the other two pillars of our building policies that I tried to outline. So we are able to show significant savings and from the energy advice programs, and so far we have been able to convince our funders to continue the provision of this funding.
All right, and thank you again, Christiane. And that is all the questions that I have received from the audience. So I'd just like to thank you again for addressing those and for a good discussion, and thank the audience for submitting those. And we have a few extra minutes. I'd like to give each of you a chance to, for any closing remarks or anything that you'd like to say. Why don't we start with, we'll start with Jim first.
Hello. Yeah, thanks again for this opportunity to address an international audience, and we do have goals in many of our states and many of our cities, but not yet nationally, and we will be evolving our codes eventually towards more performance orientation just to be able to achieve those goals. So you know, I think this is the right topic to be talking about, getting people in the communities comfortable with these concepts, because this is the way we're actually going to achieve the goals, to make the impact on the global greenhouse gas emissions targets that we need to achieve. So I hope this moves the ball forward. Thanks again.
Thank you, Jim. And Ian, if you'd like to go ahead with any closing remarks you might have.
Yeah, I mean, if there are any state or local or regional governments out there listening to this, I would say that, this is not a light undertaking, moving to performance-based codes and building rating and labeling, but I think it fits very well into a lot of other planning goals that we have at the state and regional government level, and also at the local level, as people set climate targets or energy targets, or are worried about congestion or other challenges in delivering reliable energy to buildings. It really seems to hit a number of different challenges that we have in governance with a fairly comprehensive solution. So I'd encourage people to take a really close look at it and look at where they have leverage to start down this process. We've had success so far, and we're looking forward to maybe following in Austrian footsteps a little bit. I think it feels like there's some momentum coming behind this approach.
Thank you, Ian. And Christiane?
Well, I think I'll come back to what I said earlier. The building sector is a very varied field. There's no one fits it all for anything, and the beauty of performance-based codes is it empowers flexibility and informed choices. And we found once we were able to explain the concept that many people liked very much, that they could make their own choices, what they want, in terms of the technologies they want to use, provided they met the energy requirements. And with that flexibility and the ability to choose the right solution for yourself, I think this is what has really driven the policy in this field, that I cannot actually imagine any other building codes than performance-based ones.
Thank you again to the panelists. And now I'd just like to ask our audience to take a minute to answer a quick survey. We just have 3 questions on the webinar that you viewed today. Your feedback just helps us improve for the next ones and know that we are doing well where we are. So Heather, could you please display the first question? And that first question, which can be answered in the webinar panel, is the webinar content provided me with useful information and insight. And the next question, the webinar's presenters were effective. And the final question is, overall, the webinar met my expectations. All right, thank you for answering our survey. And on behalf of the Clean Energy Solutions Center, I'd just like to extend another hearty thank you to all of our expert panelists and to our attendees for participating in today's webinar. We did have a great audience, a great discussion at the end, and some good questions, and we just appreciate your time. So I invite you to, the attendees, to check the Solutions Center website over the next few days or next few weeks. We will be posting an audio recording of this presentation, as well as PDF copies of the slides. And you can also look at the other Green Building Performance Network webinars on similar topics.
Sean, sorry to interrupt, but Neve would like to make a closing remark as well. Could we jump in with Neve before we wrap? Thank you.
Definitely. Sorry about that, Neve. Go ahead.
No problem, Sean. I just want to express my thanks to the speakers, and also just to say that best practice sharing is really a great way of fast tracking towards zero energy and a great way of making meaningful energy savings. So rather than starting from zero, it's better to build on what we already have out there. So thank you again to the speakers for facilitating that. And thank you, Sean.
Yep. Thank you, Neve. Yep, so again, you can just see the audio recording and the slides on the Solutions Center website. And just hope that everyone has a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you again at future events. And with that, we conclude our webinar.